Hi and welcome back. My name's Jeremy Goldschmidt and I'm the founder and CEO of Rent Better. Thanks for joining us again in the workshop series, The Path to Managing Your Own Rental Property. This is the second session, which is focused on what are the steps involved in managing your own property. In the last session, we talked about why there is an opportunity and the benefits available to you. And we'll just do a quick recap on that and then jump straight into the content. So as I said, in the last session, we talked a little bit about the change in the market, that there's a shift towards self-management and that 33% of the market is now self-managing their own investment property. And that's driven a little bit by changing technology and consumer behaviours, but it's also driven by the price value matrix and a little bit of an erosion in trust, where perhaps people, depending on the value that they're getting from what they're paying for their property management, might be feeling like they're getting ripped off and it's not delivering the return or the value they want, and therefore they're looking for alternatives. And so then we finally talked about what is the opportunity available to you, and we looked at the expense base of an investment property and that 17% grouping, if you like, of expenses that are a way for you to deliver a higher return or get more out of your investment property, and at the same time increase the level of control that you have over that investment property. So we're going to jump straight into it now and talk about who are the owners of investment or rental properties in this country. And again, we lean on the stats from the Australian Tax Office, or the ATO, who did a deep dive into those who are claiming rental income on their tax returns and provide some really great insights for us to understand the market. Because what you'll find is the two things that they helped us to deliver here and that are on this chart is a breakdown by age bracket. So if you're claiming rental income on your tax income, what age bracket do you fit into? And there's the sort of less than 29, the 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59 and 60 plus. So you can see that spread of age groups. And then you can see in the two categories, the blue is those people who are earning less than 100,000 a year in income. And the black is the group, the small group each time, that are earning more than 100K. And so the first point to make from seeing this chart is you can see at the top here the percentages of each age group. And so obviously there's a heavy skew that way, where you sort of start to see 70+% of the market, or of those people who own rental properties, are actually 40 plus. And it makes total sense, right? It's not so easy to save up for a deposit and purchase an investment property. It does take time, so it's natural that the older population of this country are owning the investment properties. And if you were to look even further in, you can see that, obviously a big skew towards the older segment again of the 50 pluses. So the first thing to note is, again, that older people tend to be the ones who are owning investment properties and claiming rental income. And the second really important factor here is, again, this bottom segment here, where you see across each age group, it's probably 70+% of people who are the ones who are in fact earning less than 100K of income and own the property. And I think that's a really important fact, because people believe that, it's a sort of a titan or a property mogul who has billions of dollars who owns investment properties. And this just, really proves that the people, again, who in this country own investment properties are likely to be over 40 and are likely to be earning less than 100K a year, which means it's, everyone's mum and dad. It's the teachers and the nurses and the police officers and the plumbers. It's, the everyday people of this country. You don't have to be a billionaire to do it. And I think that's a really important fact to take away from this, is that we have a really broad participation in the property market in Australia. So if everyone out there is owning investment properties, then it's really natural for those people to look for ways to drive up the return on that investment property and get more out of it. And I just want to pause for a minute, because one of my favourite stories on this topic is one of our customers who really has a terrific story, and it's a great example of how you really can manage your own property in different ways. And so she happened to be quite heavily pregnant and was put on bed rest, and at the same time had perhaps a less than ideal experience with an agent, and decided that she was going to manage the property herself. But that was right before she went into bed rest, or was told to go on bed rest. And so the experience that she had actually was through using the Rent Better platform was able to actually, from hospital in bed, find tenants, organise the lease agreement, get them set up through the platform, get the payments going, and actually secure a tenant for her property, all while literally lying on her back in bed in a hospital. And we think this is the sort of thing, again, that you see from a sort of entrepreneurial spirit of somebody who owns an investment property. And of course, it's a way to create wealth, but there's also an element of you managing and taking control of your investment. So personally, I think that's a really terrific, example of someone taking advantage of the savings and the control that are available to you by self-managing. So I'm just going to turn over now. Now, without any further delay, let's jump into the 5 steps as we've talked about it. Now, with anything, the first time you do it, it can feel complex and daunting, and like there's a lot of processes and forms and documents and things that I need to keep track of. And I recognize, again, that anything you do the first time can feel a little bit tricky or daunting. But the whole point of these sessions, and the whole point of our platform, in fact, is to demystify it a little bit, is to help you understand there's a framework and that there's a method and a way to do things. And with that organisation and that structure, it will make you feel a little bit more comfortable about doing it, and it will help you take these actions because they won't feel so foreign or, I don't want to say scary, but less familiar, and you will very, very quickly become familiar because there's a guided and structured process for you to follow. And that's the benefit of a framework, really. So we're going to go through a little bit of a framework in a second. But I just want to talk about, if you like, the concept here, because there is a life cycle to property management that sits within any framework. And let's just assume that this is sort of day dot when you purchase your property. And this is, the end of time when you decide to sell it or do something different with that property. And yes, there's one large life cycle there, right? There's obviously the purchase and the transaction of buying it, and then there's the sale transaction of selling it. But within that process and within that big macro framework, there's lots of little cycles and lots of little frameworks. And we call those basically, they're your tenancies. Each one of those little cycles is a series of events that one needs to do in order to get the return on your investment, which is obviously being paid rental income. And then at the same time, there'll be expenses and things that one must manage. But you're basically managing a lot of little cycles within the big cycle. And that's really important. And what we want to do is go a little bit deeper on what those little cycles look like and unpack them a bit. So there's 5 key steps, as I mentioned. The first is to basically advertise your property to find a tenant. The second is to select a tenant. The third is to set up your tenancy, then oversee that tenancy, and then complete the transition of that tenancy. Now, I number them in terms of 1 to 5, but it's really important to note that this is not always a linear process. It is in fact a cycle. You don't always have to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You may find that you've purchased a property that already has a tenant in there and the tenancy's already been set up, in which case you're probably sitting between these 2 points where you take over and you just want to make sure that everything's done, and now you're going to continue to manage it. You may take over, or you may actually have had a tenant that's leaving, in which case you just need to advertise the property and find a new tenant. So you're going to enter here at the top. Alternatively, and again, you may take over the property from a family member or purchase it from someone again, and you're going to just transition the tenant out. So they're at the final stages and they've decided they're leaving. So there are a whole range of different entry points into this cycle, but being clear on what's involved in each step is really important. And so for the sake of, some structure and a way to do this, we're going to guide through each of them one at a time. And I will say before we go into this, even though we're going to cover each of these points, there is quite a sort of wealth of videos and content available through the website or even on our YouTube channel if you wanted to pick on any one of these topics. But when we look at advertise the property, well, what does that mean, right? So there's really 3 components in there to finding the tenant. The first is going to be obviously creating that ad. Now, you'll see that we typically recommend going on the largest and biggest sites where you'll get the most exposure, and that tends to be realestate.com.au, domain.com.au, and rent.com.au. Each of those platforms will spend millions and millions of dollars each year attracting eyeballs from tenants, so there's a lot of value to being on there. There are certainly some other free websites and places where you can advertise. We've typically found that the quality of traffic that comes through them is sort of less beneficial than those that go through the mainstream sites. But obviously horses for courses, and people will find different ways of doing things. But we would typically recommend going to the places where you'll get the maximum number of eyeballs. Once your ads are live on those sites, you'll get inquiries, and then you'll actually want to host inspections. Now, how you manage those inquiries, again, you can sort of do some vetting via email by communicating back and forth. You can, instead of having a sort of private inspection time advertised, you could advertise public inspection times. We typically find that drives less inquiries because people will just come or not come if they're interested in the inspection. And when it gets to the inspections, again, we typically recommend for the first inspection, don't put a public time up because it gives you a chance to gauge the audience and gauge the demand for your property. So you can see who's inquiring, what they're interested in, and really understand what's the level of interest in the market. Now, once you've got those three things going, you'll get to a place where you are hosting those inspections and seeing people come through. And then you want to start to get into your selection process. So ideally here, you're going to get applications, you're going to start to run tenant checks, and you're going to basically get to a place where you're doing some final reference checks on people. So what do we mean by that? Well, applications are basically a form that's going to gather information about the particular tenant or the prospective tenant so that you can make a determination. So it would include a lot of personal information about living circumstances, employment. In fact, income is usually included in there, perhaps past finances so that you can see that there is an ability to pay. And what you're doing in this application process is really gathering. You might get multiple applicants and you're going to be able to see on paper who is likely to be able to pay for the property and take care of the property. On the basis that you you feel that one of the tenants might be more appropriate for the property, you would then go into a process of actually checking them through the National Tenancy Database, which is run by Equifax, and that's going to give you a sense of whether there's any sort of bad history in terms of blacklistings or any bankruptcies or any red flags in terms of identity. And it's going to give you, again, a second source by which you can use to make a decision. So the first source is the application and the paper-based view. The second one is being able to see an external view, which is through that tenant check. And then the third source is really using referees or if you like, employment check, and then making sure that you've spoken to perhaps a past landlord and having met that person, again, applying your judgment so that you've got three different sources that you can triangulate around to make a decision and select the tenant. And it's a really important step because it does become, if you like, the control point for who's going to be the right tenant and the right fit for your property. And we will have sometimes people ask us, well, why am I a good judge, or how am I going to be a good judge of who the right tenant to fit in the property is? And I guess the benefit of doing it is that you're more likely to be a judge of who's the right character or the right person to be in your property rather than someone else who's incentivized and getting paid on the basis of having someone in the property. So I think that most property owners, or at least the customers that we will speak to, feel really confident about the ability to use these different sources to make a decision. And there's certainly always more sources available if you do have any questions or have problems with that. Then you're going to go into setting up the tenancy. And it's really important here that you do this right, because you obviously, from a legal perspective, want to be covered. And from an arrangements point of view, and what I mean by arrangements is all the extra terms, if you have a garden and you want that maintained, or if you, from a condition report, if on entry you're going to go in and say, well, we all know that the carpet is torn in the corner there, that's documented at the beginning of the process so that both you and tenant are comfortable with the state and the, if you like, benchmark of where the property is at in terms of quality, so that you start correctly. And then finally, there's a bond. And that's really a security deposit that's paid by the tenant to the bond authority. And again, depending on your state, there's different bond authorities and different processes. But ultimately, it's used as a way to protect you as the landlord should there be some damage or something going wrong, and make sure that you've typically about 4 weeks rent is held on that basis. So in the process of setting up the tenancy, you want to do the lease agreement, the condition report, and then set up a bond. Now that you're in the process and you actually set up the tenancy, you're going to want to jump to overseeing it. And there's a couple of really important things here. The first, obviously, is getting paid your rental income. It's why you bought the property. You didn't do it to sign documents and follow legal agreements. You did it so that you can get a return on it, which often comes in the form of rental income. So it's really important that, number one, at the beginning, you and your tenant set up a rental payment schedule, and it's really clear what that is. Whether it's weekly or fortnightly or monthly, it's really important at the beginning to set that out and even to set up the schedule and the dates when payments are expected. We'll sometimes hear people say, oh, my tenant just tells me when they want to pay me, and then I get a lump sum and hope that that covers it for a certain period of time. Now, that may work, and if there's a relationship that accommodates that, that's fine. But ultimately, as a landlord, if you thought of your property as an investment, you want the return based on the agreement that you just signed, which is a legal document. And if it's going to be fortnightly, it should be paid fortnightly. And if it's going to be paid fortnightly, it should be receipted, and it should be documented in a ledger, and there should be a record of that payment made. So it's really important that if you expect sort of professional behaviour from your tenant, that you are able to act in an equal and reciprocating way where you are professionally handling rental payments and income. The next two parts are really around the expenses, which is being able to track it and have a place where you can capture those expenses. And it becomes important, we'll talk about this in a minute, but for your end of year report, you don't want to miss expenses captured through the year where, I don't know, you may need a locksmith or a plumber or an electrician, whatever it is. You don't want to forget about that come tax time. So it's really important to record that somewhere and make sure that it's in the list. And then finally, maintenance, which again, we believe for your tenant, it's really important for them to have a method and a way to sort of send through a maintenance request and have it documented. And for you as the landlord to be able to deal with that, whether it's saying that's not necessary and it's not required, or I've got that and we'll sort that out tomorrow, it's really important to track it. And again, those maintenance or repairs events will typically have an expense attached to it, so you want it recorded for tax time. So overseeing the actual tenancy is going to involve a combination of the payments, the expenses and maintenance, and then again you'll typically do a routine inspection or have that condition report come up again, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So assuming you've done all of that, you're going to move into the completion or the transition stage of your tenancy, and that's a combination of one, exiting the tenant. So typically there's a ledger and a document that sort of captures all the payments and the record of receipts of those payments. You're going to want to review that condition report, which, as I mentioned, you could do a condition report in the middle of the tenancy as an inspection, or coming to the end, you'll review the document you created in the first and early stages of the agreement, where it's got a record of the state of the property and how it should be returned, or if there's damages or anything that needs repairs, it can be noted there. So having that well documented and easily accessible is really important. And then finally, your tenant's probably going to want to have some sort of ledger that they can take away with them. So it's going to be really important for them to have access to that as well. So on those points, we basically, as I said before, have an enormous amount of detail and extra information available in video form or through our website. You'll see that there's an ebook which has a lot more detail, as well as the YouTube videos. So we could talk about this for hours, and we're always very happy to, but we'll probably draw this to a close at these 5 steps. And I think what we want to do in the next session is start to dive even deeper. So if we started in session 1 with why is this an opportunity? And in session 2, we've talked about, well, what are all the things I need to deal with and what are all the things I need to do as steps in this process? The next session is going to focus on the next level down, which is how do I go about doing that? And again, we really want to focus these sessions on an action to bias. So there is a idea that I've considered self-managing, but actually I can do it because these are the steps and the processes that I need to go through. So as we draw to a close, I just want to thank you all for joining us again and for attending the session. If you have any questions or comments, again, please leave them in the section below, or you're always welcome to email us at info@rentbetter.com.au. Thank you very much.